next talk. It's going to be Bradley and Jesse talking about Metabrain Models, biologically complex agent-based models. Bradley, over to you.
Hello. All right. Let me share my screen here. I cannot share my screen. It's disabled.
Let me make you co-host. There you go. Are you able to share now?
Okay, thank you.
All right.
There we go. Yeah. All right. So today I'm going to talk about Metabrain models, and I'm going to start by kind of giving a sort of a overview of what I'm going to talk about here. So we're taking our inspiration from brains and embodied brains, and you'll see what I mean by that in a little bit. And we think of this in terms of layers of representation. So you have these high-level representations, these low-level representations, and these sensory inputs. So the idea is there's some sensory input into the model. You have these low-level representations, which are like maybe neural networks, and we'll talk about that. And then a high-level representation, which is maybe a symbolic model. And so this is actually an outstanding issue in the AI field. People are debating, whether you can just take data and throw it into a neural network and get meaning out of it, or get some, if that's sufficient, or if you need a lot of symbolic processing as well. And so that's one of the inspirations for this. But today we're going to put this in addition into an agent-based model context. So this is where you have something coming into the sensory inputs from the environment. This is where there's communication between the high level and low level representations. And then when I say representation free, I mean it relies solely on the structure of the empirical world or some data set. When I say representation rich, I'm going to mean that it maps the empirical world to a set of signs or interpretive criterion or some model that does that. So this is the Metabrain models. This is myself and Jesse Parent, and we're on Twitter. So if you want to talk to us more, you can talk to us there. And we're from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory. So I start off with this concept, and it's going to become important as we go along. It's this idea of black box versus white box modeling. So this paper in 2015 laid this argument out where if you take a box and arrows type approach, you have three types of models, basically. The box can be either a black box, which is basically a restatement of the phenomenology, or we don't know what the mechanism is inside. It's just this thing. We have a white box, which is something that is this thing, but the inside of it is based on first principles. We don't know exactly how the mechanism works, but we know kind of how it's supposed to work. So that's what we do. And then we have these gray boxes, which are mixtures of black and white box models. And so our layers are going to be a mixture of these at various stages. And you're just going to see these boxes with names on them, but I want you to imagine what the model might look like inside. So I'm going to start out with an example that we've worked on, and this was something we presented at the NeuroMatch 3 conference, so you can link there for the video. Start with this first lower layer, this representation-free layer, which we have made salient in the form of developmental Bratenberg vehicles. So if you're familiar with Bratenberg vehicles, they're these embodied agents that have these first-order stimulus response mappings. And this is an example. This was a book by Valentino Bratenberg where he proposed these as models of a behaving organism. And so basically you have these connections between sensor and effector. You have these very basic stimuli, and then the vehicle, depending on how it's wired, will move towards the stimuli or away from the stimuli. So it yields these sort of reflexive behaviors. They're very simple neural networks, so they don't have a lot of representational capacity. But they can also, operate if you put different stimuli in the environment at different locations. You can get certain behaviors or certain wirings to behave in a certain way. And in the book, he even argued that they resemble emotional affinities, but this isn't based on a formal representation. This is just something that was interpreted from the behaviors. But how do we achieve a richer, more robust set of symbolic behaviors that might actually give us something like emotional affinities? And so we've taken this Bratenberg vehicle and made a developmental version. And so this is the developmental version where you have, instead of just a mapping between sensor and effector, you have these intermediate nodes which resemble a neural network or even a deep learning network. And the idea is in a developmental model, we sort of start to evolve nodes with in between the sensor and effector and end up with topologies that we can evaluate. These internal nodes mediate between the sensor and effector in different ways. And then this thing here, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is another type of model that we've put on top of this representation pre-model. This is a CGS kernel, and I'll talk about what that is. This is embedded amongst the internal nodes, and this is some sort of model that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So these are the internal nodes, but then there's also this representation-rich layer here. So when I talk about developmental Bradenberg vehicles, they're essentially generative models. And this is a standard Bradenberg vehicle, and the development goes on inside of it. And this is a graph of maybe how the cell, this is an example of how the cells are born and maybe die or persist over developmental time. So you have this series of cells that are, and connections that are present at certain strengths. So you end up with this topology of cells that are connected, and then we can evaluate those cells and those topologies over time. So this is something that's generated by a genetic algorithm. You have this pattern of births, deaths, and activation strengths. And then we look at the topologies that result, and we select for the most interesting or intelligent behaviors. But the DBV model of behavior alone is determined by these simple rudimentary behaviors. So even when we're evaluating a fair number of nodes in the topology, they still don't really generate what we want. But they give us a little bit more than what we would have had with a standard standard Bradenberg vehicle. So to add additional representational capacity, we want to provide behaviors with some intentionality. So that's where contextual geometric structures come in. And this is a model where we take sensory inputs and we map them to a sensory space, and we define this space by sort of what's observed. And this space is anchored by sort of the physical limits of these things, but the observations are here. And we can even, depending on the agent, we can sort them into cultures and overlap between cultures. And the classifications are often, they don't have to be based on sensory inputs. They can be based on beliefs or other things. And so we get these cultural spaces as well, where you get these soft classifications that allow us to classify things in different ways and incorporate it into a space. And so this is an example from our, we actually are presenting more on this at Cultural Evolution Society if you're going to be there, but here's a link to the video anyways if you're not. So this lays out this model in more detail. Basically, we take something like the RGB color space, and again, with color spaces, they're pretty good to work with. And you assign some meaning to the different, extent of colors. So you can also do this with shapes. So you have these very intermediate shapes or intermediate colors, and then you can link them to some meaning. And so we can actually do this where we build these conceptual kernels and sensory kernels, and we have things that run between them, and then there's feedback between them. And that gives us something that's a lot more representation rich than the Bradenberg vehicles. And so this is an example here. We have our network here, which is the low level representation. We have this here, which is the higher level representation. And then it produces this, basically it's these layered models here. And so we presented on this at the DevoNN workshop. And so there's the video if you want to see more about the how those two models are put together. And then again, we can do things like we can navigate a color gradient in space. So we can combine spatial cognition with a color gradient, recognizing colors and giving the colors sort of some sort of like an emotional valence or some sort of value, and we can do simulations like that. So I want to move on then to the next part of the talk. I'm going to bring in three names here, and they're going to become kind of important to what I'm going to say next. So Ross Ashby, in his one of his classic papers on the requisite variety, he talked about systems are too heterogeneous and information laden for reductionist approaches. Okay, I think people would agree with that. And then Simon in 1962, in Architecture of Complexity, argued hierarchy is a universal feature of complex systems. Again, that's a nice, and we're kind of showing this with these different layers. And then showing in dynamic models of segregation said, you can create segregation from random initial conditions. You can create these, you can start with a bunch of random things and you can end up with this segregated array of things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply these Metabrain models to a number of systems, a number of agent-based models, and then we'll talk about some other more advanced applications. So we'll start with the showing segregation model. So again, this is where you start out with a random initial condition and you end up with a segregated array. And you end up with, what's important, I think, about this model is not simply this emergence of order, but that there are these tipping points or transitions from random assortment to segregated patches. So it doesn't, it happens gradually, but there's some tipping point where this occurs. So how do we model this sort of thing? If we can just do it with simple rules, that's one thing, but can we add in other things, other layers of processing that might give it maybe some more, we can play around with where the tipping point happens, or maybe the agents are thinking about things. So in this Metabrain model, we propose that there's maybe a 3-layer model. And I think this shows kind of how this might work. So in this case, you might have a cellular automata which interfaces with the grid. And this is something that senses a social environment. Then it feeds forward to a neural network, which makes sense of the world. Then you have a Bayesian model at the top, which are beliefs. And there's feedback between the beliefs and the neural network and the cellular automata and the neural network. And that produces a behavior. I don't know how useful this is, and we haven't implemented this, but this is one example of how this might work. Another example is very similar in some ways. It's the ethnocentrism game, where you're trying to create, where you're going to get patches of ethnic groups. And in this case, you again have this transition point where you have it's a gradual chain and then there's a transition point from one stage to another. But in this case, we're dealing with we're dealing with the sort of ethnic aspects of it, and then we're dealing with agents. And so we have many things going on here. We can also use something like a dual inheritance approach, where you have a genetic algorithm and a neural network working together, and then one of these contextual geometric structures in a neural network working together, and they're exchanging information. Finally, I'm going to get to reaction diffusion models, and this is chemical morphogenesis. So we're moving away from the social domain into these physical and chemical models, or in biological models as well. So this is chemical morphogenesis, where you have a bunch of particles that are, again, randomly distributed, and then they exist in gradients, which then at the edges of the gradients, you have these sharp boundaries, and that's how you get pattern formation. It's a very famous model. It's been laid out in detail, but we're going to apply Metabrain models to this. So a Metabrain model for chemical morphogenesis is going to be, again, a conceptual but not model-specific function. And so this is where we have pattern production at the bottom, we have perception in the middle, and pattern recognition at the top. And that seems like a little bit odd to think, how do you incorporate perception into this reaction fusion model? But I'll show you how this works in a minute. So we're actually going to use this this paradigm called morphogenetic agents to address this problem. So recall that we're trying to form patterns, but we don't really understand what the patterns are necessarily. So what we're doing here is we have 2 sets of agents. One set is an emitter, which is on the left, and the other is a perceiver on the right. So the emitter is emitting a pattern, and the perceiver has to kind of decode that pattern from what they're seeing. And so this actually resembles maybe like a predator-prey model, where you have something that's generating a pattern, something that's recognizing a pattern. And if you think about it in nature, there's a similar dynamic where you have animals that generate patterns, but then there are also predators that sort of select upon certain patterns. They eat a lot of one pattern, but not another. One is good at camouflage, one is good at not, or being caught. So, there's that aspect. So we're just modeling this where we have the emitter and the perceiver. And so these agents, one produces a pattern, one reconstructs the pattern. So this is a good way to bring together morphogenesis and perception. And you have these agents can do both at the same time. And it's important to realize that when we look at it this way, we can see a link between spatially restricted shapes and attentional mechanisms. So we can actually look at like what attentional mechanisms form when you have patterns and what patterns form when there's attention brought onto those patterns. So it's a nice model to see what those changes look like in a single model. Also, so then I want to move on to synchronization and coordination across layers. And up to this point, I've talked about these different layers as kind of being these autonomous things maybe. But in this case, we're going to have, now we're going to consider like, how do they get integrated? What is the sort of the detail of how they get integrated? And so to do this in the model, we have two ways of thinking about this. One is borrowed directly from biology, and that's vertical integration. So vertical integration is where information is passed in one direction from one layer to another. The top layers are constraining the lower layers, and the lower layers are giving information upward. So in this case, we have a genotype to phenotype agent with 4 coordinated levels. And so this is one way to think about these levels being integrated. So in a genotype to phenotype agent, you have something at the bottom that just like some sort of gene regulatory network that's producing something from a genome. And then at subsequent layers, you have things like, organization of pattern formation, and then maybe like some other behavioral module, and then maybe some social module on top of that. So each of those layers are giving feeding information forward. And there's this culmination at the top level of organization. And, it gives insight in a single agent into emergence. Another example, though, is isometric integration. And that's what you see here. And this is actually one of the examples from before. An isometric integration is information is exchanged in geometrically specific ways. So instead of having this mechanism where you're proposing that things are moving upward and downward, they're just kind of stacked on top of one another. And some of them are modulating the activity of one's below or one's above. And it's organized in a way that is maybe optimal for that, depending on the function of the agent. So the cellular automata here is informing the neural network, but the Bayesian model is constraining the neural network. And it's that isometric integration. And you can actually shape these in different shapes, depending on where your agent's interacting and things like that. However, what about in behavior in the brain? Now that's a different story. In the model, we can do these kind of things. So before we get to what's going on in the brain, we want to talk about, revisit Ashby, and we're going to talk about feedback in the Evergood regulator theorem. So one of the things that we want to think about are these boxes and arrows generalizations, but we want to think about the global state feeding back to the local state. So we have this in each agent, we have this internal model. So if we take one of these Metabrain models, it basically forms this big internal state. And this is an approximation of the environment, but the agent doesn't really know much about the environment other than like this observation that it's making. Then the agent is sampling the empirical environment. So there's this empirical input. And then there's this copy of the internal model. It's not really what they call an efference model, but it's a matching of the environment. So you're observing the environment, then you're matching that observation with this approximation that you've made, and that feeds back to the original internal model where it's updated. And so this is, again, this goes back to the Evergood regulator theorem in a number of ways. And it gives us this nice closed loop feedback representation between the local and global states. But the brain actually does this in a number of ways. So the first way is this corticostriatal thalamocortical cortical loop that exists in the human brain. And this is where brain networks are organized in a hierarchical but distributed fashion. You have these feedback loops between, say, the sensory motor cortex, the putamen, and the thalamus. And these centers are all doing different things. They all have different functions, but they're operating in this coordinated loop, and they're putting things together in terms of cognition. So we have this model, this is one type of feedback in the brain that sort of resembles this. In the mix here is the observation of the environment that's coming into the brain. So you have this input of sensory input, you're processing it, and you're behaving on it. So in this kind of model, feedback loops predominate. And the functional nodes critically are spread out across multiple sensors. Not all the processing is going on in a single model or single location. We also have hierarchical predictive processing, and this is where you're actually trying to predict the probability of a sensory signal. So you have this feedback between error units in orange and state units in blue, and you're trying to update your state by looking at minimizing your error. Now, this isn't necessarily what Metabrain models do, but you're actually using these kind of these different sources of information in a complementary way. And in this case, it's closed loop feedback. It doesn't have to be closed loop feedback, but this is one example where it actually works to produce a predictive output, predictive behavior output. And so this is where your observations sort of constrain your behavior to optimize what's going on in the individual. And so, but can we go back to isometric integration for a minute? Can we represent these layers in a more topologically and biologically realistic manner? So I've showed you the Braitenberg vehicles, the developmental Braitenberg vehicles. I've showed you an example of a more symbolic model, and then I've shown you models of how this might fit into an agent-based setting where you have agents that are interacting in a population. You also have, other types of things that we're doing. So how do we make this sort of more biological and not just these boxes? And so we draw from two sources of inspiration for this. In our developmental Braitenberg vehicles, we implement morphogenesis. So we can actually not just generate these nodes as parts of a neural network, but we can generate these geometric shapes or geometric arrays that actually can grow over time and produce, and we can sort of specify what comes first, what comes next, and so forth. So this is an example we're drawing from an embryo where there are different germ layers, and we're able to shape different parts of this model. So we have an embodied model here where we're developing an embodied model. We're developing the sensors, we're developing the brain, but then we're also able to develop the different layers of the brain at certain times in development. So we're able to turn on different layers at different points in this process of development, and then we can map that to some sort of temporal model, like an agent-based model or any sort of model where these things are behaving. And so that's one thing that we're looking at, but we're also looking, so we're looking at morphogenesis and we're looking at metamorphosis. This is metamorphosis, what we're considering. And then morphogenesis is where we're creating these rings of neurons and putting them in an embodied context. And this allows us to array these things geometrically. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Bradley. If there are any questions, very interesting thought. I have a question. How do we know, so you presented quite a few models that are inspired off of how the biological process of cognition goes about. How do we know to select among these models? Is there some sort of fitness function?
In the case of where we're evolving Braitenberg vehicles, we use a fitness function. We use a genetic algorithm with a fitness function. We can specify fitness functions in different ways, depending on what we want. So we generate, like I said before about, we pick what looks interesting. We can put a fitness function in place, where it's maybe doing something like some sort of spatial cognition task. These different as these neural networks develop. And so that would be the fitness function. But we can make the fitness function whatever we want. We can do this for a number of models. So, we have maybe one model on top of another. One problem that exists, of course, is that these different layers will behave in different ways. So it'll conflict with the fitness function will conflict for one model versus another. So, you could have the thing integrated into a single, this is why I talked about this metamorphosis slide. You can actually sort of have these things turn on in development. So you can maybe evaluate the neural network first, and then you have this secondary symbolic layer that operates second. And then you know, maybe that just runs without any sort of selection, or you can just select on that. And then that's also part of the model. And then it's generating behavior. So, I mean, there are a lot of ways to implement a model or a fitness function in this case.
I had a quick question, Bradley. So I was struck by your list of all the different kind of goals for modeling for the brain, right? Like, and it struck me that, you know, and I'll have to spend some time looking at your slides again, right? But it struck me that that those might not be that specific to the brain, right? That they might be general goals for modeling for any kind of computational system, right? And so I was just kind of curious if you had some thoughts on that, or how general those goals you laid out are.
Yeah, I think they can be applied to a lot of different areas. So the idea of a metabrain is just simply like we're applying different types of intelligent systems to a problem, and then that's sort of like it's, you know, it's sort of bio-inspired. But I mean, you know, our goals for kind of modeling are, you know, so, you know, we're kind of trying to approximate the brain. We're also trying to approximate some real world system where, you know, we're trying to do something. And so that's where it comes in, where, you know, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's the brain or some other thing that we're modeling. There's this more general imperative. And so, you know, we're trying to just build this sort of, you know, scaffolding so that we can build an intelligent system. And whether that's modeling the brain or modeling some other phenomenon, that's those goals sort of converge.
Great.
Great. Okay, if there are no further questions, I think we can move on to the next talk. Thank you so much, Bradley.